Her husband said, "This is a safe space. Let's not bring up the past." So I didn't bring up the fund either. The February wind howled through downtown Detroit as I parked my modest sedan outside the Riverside Community Center, watching the snow swirl against the yellow streetlights. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, not from the cold but from the anxiety that had been building all week about attending my first trauma support group meeting since retiring from the Detroit Police Department 6 months ago. 24 years of service had left me with scars that weren't visible on the surface. Night terrors, hypervigilance, and a drinking problem that had nearly cost me my marriage before I finally admitted I needed help. The department psychologist had recommended the civilian support group specifically designed for first responders dealing with PTSD, promising that sharing experiences with others who understood the unique challenges of law enforcement would be more beneficial than traditional therapy alone. If this story is resonating with you, please comment below where you're watching from, give this video a like, and subscribe to our channel because we truly help families going through these difficult situations. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of healing and finding strength in our darkest moments. What none of the other group members would know that evening was that folded carefully in my wallet was a cashier's check for $8.5 million. The final settlement from a class action lawsuit against the city for decades of inadequate mental health support that had resulted in numerous officer suicides, destroyed marriages, and untreated trauma that had devastated entire families within the police community. The legal battle had taken 5 years to resolve, involving hundreds of current and retired officers who had suffered psychological injuries during their service without receiving proper treatment or support from the department. My case had been particularly strong because I had documented evidence of multiple requests for counseling that were denied, delayed, or dismissed by supervisors who believed that seeking mental health treatment was a sign of weakness rather than a necessary part of maintaining officer safety and effectiveness. I had been one of the lead plaintiffs in the lawsuit, working closely with attorneys who specialized in police misconduct and institutional negligence cases. The process had been emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive traumatic incidents from my career while building a legal case that proved the department's systematic failure to provide adequate mental health resources had directly contributed to my psychological injuries and ongoing treatment needs. The settlement amount reflected not just compensation for medical expenses and lost wages, but also recognition of the lifelong impact of untreated trauma on my ability to maintain relationships, enjoy life, and function normally in civilian society after retirement. The money couldn't erase the memories of crime scenes, violent confrontations, and tragic situations that haunted my dreams, but it provided validation that my suffering had been acknowledged and would be properly addressed. For the past 6 months, I had been working with a team of financial advisors and therapists to develop a comprehensive treatment plan that would address both my immediate needs and long-term recovery goals. The settlement had given me the financial freedom to pursue intensive therapy, attend residential treatment programs, and explore alternative treatments that weren't covered by standard insurance policies. Walking into the community center that evening, I was struck by how ordinary the setting appeared for such an important moment in my recovery journey. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle in a small conference room decorated with motivational posters and artificial plants, and a coffee station had been set up on a table near the window where several people were already gathering and making small talk. The group facilitator was Dr. Sarah Martinez, a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in trauma treatment and had extensive experience working with first responders. She welcomed me warmly and introduced me to the other members, explaining that the group maintained strict confidentiality and followed specific guidelines designed to create a safe environment for sharing difficult experiences and emotions. The other participants included 2 firefighters, a paramedic, a corrections officer, and 3 other retired police officers, along with 2 spouses who attended to better understand their partner's struggles and learn coping strategies for supporting their family members through the recovery process. Everyone seemed genuinely welcoming and supportive, sharing the kind of understanding that could only come from similar experiences with trauma and its aftermath. One couple in particular caught my attention. Detective James Peterson, a recently retired narcotics investigator, and his wife Linda, an elegantly dressed woman who spoke confidently about their journey through James's PTSD diagnosis and treatment. They had been attending the group for 8 months and were often cited by Dr. Martinez as an example of successful partnership in trauma recovery. Linda Peterson commanded attention whenever she spoke, offering advice to other group members about communication strategies, treatment options, and relationship dynamics during recovery. She frequently emphasized the importance of moving forward rather than dwelling on the past, and spoke about their successful transition to civilian life after James's retirement from a 30-year career in law enforcement. During that first meeting, I shared briefly about my background and the challenges I was facing with sleep disturbances, anxiety, and relationship difficulties that had developed over the course of my career. The group listened supportively, and several members offered encouragement and suggestions based on their own experiences with similar symptoms and recovery strategies. James Peterson seemed particularly interested in my story, asking detailed questions about specific incidents that had contributed to my trauma and the timeline of when my symptoms had become severe enough to impact my work performance and personal relationships. His questions felt more like an interrogation than supportive inquiry, but I attributed this to his investigative background and assumed he was trying to understand similarities between our experiences. Linda, however, took a different approach to my introduction. She immediately began offering advice about mindset and personal responsibility in recovery, suggesting that successful healing required individuals to take control of their narrative and avoid playing the victim role in their own recovery process. Her comments felt dismissive and judgmental, but I tried to remain open to different perspectives on trauma treatment. As the weeks passed and I continued attending meetings, I began to notice a pattern in how Linda Peterson interacted with group members who were struggling with severe symptoms or complex trauma histories. She consistently emphasized moving forward and would become visibly impatient when people shared stories about ongoing nightmares, panic attacks, or relationship problems that interfered with their daily functioning. During one particularly difficult session, I had shared about a recent panic attack I had experienced while grocery shopping when I heard what sounded like gunshots but turned out to be a car backfiring in the parking lot. The incident had triggered flashbacks to a shooting I had been involved in during my career, and I had been forced to leave my cart and go home without completing my shopping because I couldn't stop shaking and hyperventilating. Linda's response to my story was swift and unsympathetic. She suggested that I was allowing myself to be controlled by fear, and that I needed to push through these episodes instead of giving in to them. She went on to explain that James had experienced similar reactions early in his recovery, but had learned to mind over matter his way through triggering situations by focusing on positive thoughts and refusing to let the past control his present behavior. Her husband James nodded along with her assessment, adding that he had found success by simply deciding not to let the job define him anymore and making a conscious choice to leave work at work even though he was already retired. He suggested that ongoing symptoms were often the result of mental weakness rather than genuine medical conditions, and that most officers could overcome PTSD through willpower and determination rather than medication or intensive therapy. The other group members looked uncomfortable during this exchange, and Dr. Martinez attempted to redirect the conversation toward more supportive and evidence-based approaches to trauma recovery. However, Linda continued to dominate the discussion, insisting that her husband's recovery proved that anyone can overcome PTSD if they really want to, and that continued symptoms were often signs of secondary gain or attention-seeking behavior. The situation reached a breaking point during my 4th month attending the group, when I shared about a setback I had experienced after attending a former colleague's funeral. The service had been particularly difficult because the officer had died by suicide, and the ceremony had triggered intense guilt and sadness about friends I had lost to PTSD-related deaths during my career. I explained to the group that the funeral had brought back memories of my own darkest moments when I had considered suicide as a way to escape the psychological pain and intrusive thoughts that had dominated my life before seeking treatment. I described how the experience had made me grateful for the treatment I was receiving and the support system I had built, but also reminded me how easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't gotten help when I did. Linda Peterson's reaction was immediate and harsh. She interrupted my story to say, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. We've created this safe space to move forward and heal, but some people insist on bringing up the past and wallowing in negativity instead of focusing on solutions and progress. James and I have made a commitment to leave the past behind us, and frankly, I think everyone would benefit from that approach." Her husband James quickly supported her statement, adding, "Linda's absolutely right. This is supposed to be a safe space where we focus on moving forward, not a place where we constantly rehash old traumas and keep ourselves stuck in victim mentality. Let's not bring up the past anymore." It's not helping anyone here recover or build better lives." The room fell silent as other group members processed what had just been said. Dr. Martinez looked stunned by the Petersons' dismissal of trauma processing, which contradicted everything evidence-based treatment recommended for PTSD recovery. Several other group members appeared hurt and confused by the suggestion that sharing their experiences was somehow harmful or self-indulgent rather than an essential part of healing. I felt a familiar surge of anger rising in my chest. The same protective instinct that had served me well during dangerous situations as a police officer, but had become problematic in civilian interactions where conflict resolution required different skills. However, instead of responding with anger, I made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of that evening and everyone's understanding of the situation. I reached for my wallet and pulled out the cashier's check that I had been carrying for weeks, unsure of when or how to use it for maximum impact in my recovery journey. I placed it on the coffee table in the center of our circle, where everyone could see the bank logo, the amount, and my name as the payee. "You're absolutely right, James," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "This is supposed to be a safe space where we focus on moving forward. Since we're not bringing up the past anymore, I won't mention that this settlement check represents $8.5 million in compensation for the psychological injuries I sustained during my career because the department failed to provide adequate mental health support." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda Peterson stared at the check, her confident demeanor cracking as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. James leaned forward to get a better look at the document, his face showing confusion and disbelief as he tried to reconcile this new information with his assumptions about my situation. I continued speaking, maintaining eye contact with Linda as I explained the significance of what they were looking at. "This represents 5 years of legal battles to prove that the trauma symptoms you've been dismissing as weakness or attention-seeking behavior are actually legitimate medical conditions caused by institutional negligence. The settlement amount reflects not just my individual case, but validation for hundreds of officers whose psychological injuries were ignored, minimized, or dismissed by people who believed mental toughness could overcome chemical imbalances in the brain." The other group members were staring at the check with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to confusion about what this revelation meant for our group dynamics. Dr. Martinez looked intrigued by this development and seemed to be mentally adjusting her assessment of my case and treatment needs based on this new information about my resources and legal validation. Linda Peterson was clearly struggling to process how dramatically her understanding of my situation had just changed. The woman who had been lecturing me about personal responsibility and moving forward was now confronted with evidence that my trauma had been serious enough to warrant millions of dollars in legal compensation, contradicting her narrative about willpower being sufficient for recovery. "I won't bring up the past," I repeated, returning the check to my wallet. "Like how this settlement will fund a new treatment center specifically designed for first responders with complex PTSD, or how the legal precedent we established will make it easier for other officers to get the help they need without being stigmatized or dismissed. Since we're focusing on the future, I'll just mention that I'm using this opportunity to ensure that other people won't have to fight for 5 years to get recognition that their psychological injuries deserve the same medical attention as physical wounds." The transformation in the room was palpable. Linda Peterson, who had been the dominant voice offering unsolicited advice to everyone, suddenly seemed small and uncertain. Her husband James, who had been supporting her dismissive attitude toward trauma symptoms, looked embarrassed and began stammering apologies for their previous comments. Dr. Martinez seized the moment to redirect the conversation toward more productive territory, acknowledging that my experience highlighted important issues about trauma validation, treatment access, and the need for systemic changes in how first responders' mental health needs are addressed. She thanked me for sharing such significant information and invited other group members to reflect on what they had learned from this revelation. One of the other retired officers spoke up to say that my willingness to pursue legal action had probably benefited all of them by establishing precedents and raising awareness about PTSD as a legitimate occupational hazard. The paramedic mentioned that her department had recently implemented new mental health protocols that were likely influenced by lawsuits like mine that had forced institutions to take psychological injuries seriously. Over the following weeks, the group dynamic changed dramatically. Linda Peterson became much quieter during meetings, no longer offering advice about recovery strategies or criticizing other members for struggling with ongoing symptoms. James seemed genuinely remorseful about their previous attitude and began asking thoughtful questions about treatment approaches and trauma research rather than promoting willpower-based solutions. More importantly, the other group members seemed more comfortable sharing difficult experiences and setbacks, knowing that their struggles were being taken seriously rather than dismissed as character flaws or lack of motivation. Dr. Martinez began incorporating more discussion about trauma validation and systemic issues into our sessions, helping everyone understand that their injuries were legitimate medical conditions rather than personal failings. 3 months after that pivotal evening, Linda Peterson approached me privately after a group meeting to offer a heartfelt apology for her previous behavior. She admitted that her attitude had been influenced by her own fear and frustration about James's condition, and that she had been trying to convince herself that PTSD could be overcome through positive thinking because accepting its medical reality felt too overwhelming and frightening. She explained that seeing my settlement check had forced her to confront the fact that trauma symptoms were serious enough to warrant significant legal compensation, which had helped her understand that James's struggles were not his fault or a reflection of weakness, but rather the predictable result of exposure to traumatic events without adequate support or treatment. James also apologized, acknowledging that his dismissive attitude toward trauma symptoms had been a defense mechanism to avoid dealing with his own ongoing struggles. He admitted that he had been experiencing symptoms that he had been hiding even from Linda, including nightmares, anxiety, and intrusive thoughts that he had been managing through alcohol and isolation rather than addressing through proper treatment. The revelation about my settlement had encouraged both of them to pursue more intensive treatment options and to approach recovery with greater humility and openness to professional guidance. They began attending individual therapy sessions in addition to the group meetings and started exploring trauma-specific treatments that they had previously dismissed as unnecessary or ineffective. 6 months after that confrontational evening, I was invited to speak at a national conference for first responders and mental health professionals about the intersection of legal advocacy and trauma recovery. My presentation focused on how the settlement had provided not just financial compensation but also validation and resources that had accelerated my healing process in ways that traditional therapy alone might not have achieved. The conference audience included hundreds of police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and mental health professionals who were working to improve trauma treatment and reduce stigma around seeking help for psychological injuries. My story resonated with many attendees who had experienced similar dismissive attitudes from colleagues, supervisors, or family members who didn't understand the medical nature of PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. During my presentation, I emphasized that while not everyone would have access to large legal settlements, the principles that had guided my case, documentation of symptoms, persistence in seeking treatment, and advocacy for systemic change, were applicable to anyone struggling with occupational trauma. I encouraged attendees to view their psychological injuries as legitimate medical conditions deserving of proper treatment rather than character flaws to be overcome through willpower. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees sharing their own stories of struggle and recovery during the question and answer session. Several mental health professionals mentioned that they planned to use my case as an example when working with clients who had been told that their trauma symptoms were signs of weakness rather than legitimate medical conditions. 1 year after Linda Peterson told our trauma support group that we should stop bringing up the past and focus on moving forward through positive thinking, I used part of my settlement to establish the First Responder Trauma Recovery Foundation, dedicated to providing comprehensive treatment options and legal advocacy for police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and other first responders dealing with occupational PTSD and related conditions. The Foundation's first initiative was to fund the trauma treatment center I had mentioned during that pivotal group meeting, located in downtown Detroit and specifically designed to address the unique needs of first responders whose psychological injuries had been caused or exacerbated by inadequate institutional support. The center offers evidence-based treatments including EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, medication management, and innovative approaches like equine therapy and wilderness programs. James and Linda Peterson were among the first clients to receive services at the new treatment center, participating in an intensive couples therapy program designed to help families rebuild relationships that had been damaged by untreated trauma. Their transformation from dismissive critics to grateful advocates for trauma treatment became one of the center's most compelling success stories, frequently cited in presentations and marketing materials. Today, 3 years after that February evening when Linda Peterson insisted that our support group stop bringing up the past, The treatment center has served over 800 first responders and their family members, providing comprehensive care that addresses both individual trauma symptoms and the systemic issues that contribute to occupational psychological injuries. The legal precedent established by my case and others like it has resulted in significant policy changes within police departments, fire departments, and EMS agencies throughout the state, including mandatory mental health screenings, improved access to confidential counseling services, and protection against retaliation for officers who seek treatment for psychological injuries. My own recovery journey has continued to evolve, with the financial security provided by the settlement allowing me to pursue experimental treatments, attend specialized programs, and work with leading experts in trauma recovery. While I still experience symptoms and challenging days, I have developed effective coping strategies and built a strong support network that helps me maintain stability and continue my advocacy work. The woman who once sat in our trauma support group and dismissed PTSD symptoms as lack of willpower had no idea that her target possessed resources that would ultimately transform treatment options for thousands of first responders and their families. Her ignorance and insensitivity had revealed more about her own fears and limitations than about the validity of trauma injuries, and her words had ultimately motivated me to prove that psychological wounds deserve the same recognition and treatment as physical injuries. The $8.5 million settlement that Linda Peterson never knew about has grown through careful investment and continues to fund expanding programs that address the mental health needs of first responders throughout the region. But more importantly, it has provided validation and hope for countless individuals who had been told that their trauma symptoms were signs of weakness rather than legitimate medical conditions requiring professional treatment. Our story has become one of transformation and advocacy, demonstrating that even the most challenging psychological injuries can be overcome with proper treatment, support, and resources. The dismissive attitudes that once dominated discussions about first responder mental health are gradually being replaced by evidence-based approaches that recognize trauma as an occupational hazard requiring the same attention and resources as physical safety measures. The settlement that initially seemed like compensation for past injuries has become a foundation for future healing, allowing me to transform personal suffering into community benefit and proving that recovery from trauma is possible when individuals have access to proper treatment, validation, and support. The past that Linda Peterson wanted to ignore has become the foundation for a future where first responders' psychological injuries are recognized, treated, and prevented through improved policies and practices. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment below and let us know where you are watching from, as well as your thoughts on trauma recovery and the importance of supporting our first responders through their healing journeys. Every perspective matters, because stories like these remind us that while trauma can be devastating, there is always an opportunity for healing, growth, and positive change when we approach recovery with compassion and evidence-based treatment. When you engage, whether it's through commenting, liking, or subscribing, you are helping us build a community where first responders and their families can feel less alone and more supported. Many people silently carry the burden of occupational trauma, and often just hearing that someone else understands can provide enormous relief and hope. This channel is more than a platform for stories. It's a space where healing, resilience, and solidarity take center stage. Your support allows us to continue creating and sharing content that uplifts, inspires, and shines a light on the very real challenges that first responders face in their recovery journeys. We believe that even in the most difficult circumstances, there are lessons to be learned and strength to be found. And together, by engaging with these stories, we can remind one another that no one has to navigate their healing journey in isolation. So please, if this message resonates with you, don't hesitate to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you're not just supporting us. You're standing with countless first responders and their families around the world who find courage and comfort in knowing that they are part of a wider circle of understanding and care. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for helping us continue to share these powerful stories of trauma recovery and hope.